It's great to have Andrew Bustamante back on the program. Andrew's a former covert CIA officer and also founder of the Everyday Espionage training platform. Great to have you back on, Andrew.
Hey, David, it's great to be here, man. It's been a while since we
It's
last
been a
sat
while.
together.
It's been a while. We were joking. We both were a lot younger last time you were on. So listen, I mean, for people in my audience who don't know about some of your experience, give us like a brief overview of your role at the CIA and the sort of things you worked on.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Andrew Bustamante. I'm a former CIA intelligence officer. I served with CIA from 2007 to 2014, and I served primarily in a clandestine operations role, which is what most people call an undercover role. I left in 2014, started a business, and my business is how I currently make a living, teaching the same skills I learned at CIA to everyday people in a way of teaching them how to break barriers.
So I want to get to some of those skills in a moment. In terms of your work at CIA, when you talk about clandestine, give me a some or all of the above. People then didn't know what you were doing. You still can't talk specifically about what you were doing. Family didn't even know generically what your job was. I mean, like, what degree of clandestine are we talking?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was part of the clandestine ops corps, which is the second deepest core. The deepest core of clandestine operations is essentially a program that I can't even talk about with by the real name of the program, right? And that's where you have your individuals who are so deep that there's no attribution of them at all on American records. I was one step above that, working for what's called the National Clandestine Service, or the NCS. My parents did not know what I did. My girlfriends did not know what I did. My siblings did not know what I did. They all thought that I worked for an organization that I was attributed with, meaning my tax records, my pay stubs, my health insurance all came from a completely different organization. And that's who everybody thought I worked for, when in reality, I was working for CIA.
So, to be clear, not only did the people you just mentioned not know that you were part of NCS, they didn't even know you worked at CIA.
Correct, correct. That NCS, the National Clandestine Service, is essentially an office within the larger CIA, and that's how CIA is structured, just like any other government organization. Only it's obviously much more interesting.
What can you tell us about the recruitment process so when you start talking about this role to the CIA, presumably they know that at the end of the rainbow, there is this level of secrecy around the role. You may or may not know that right away, but it would be normal to talk to people in your life about, I'm interviewing or whatever the term would be. How early are you told we need secrecy even as far as the process that is going on here?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, because there's so much sensitivity around these clandestine roles, the first phone call that you get is a very generic phone call, the invitation or the offer to the first interview, because it's very much a recruiting type of organization. They don't wait for you, can't apply
Yeah.
for that type of role. You can apply for a different role, but then get flagged for a clandestine role.
Yep.
So there's a number of different ways that they find you, but either way, a recruiter will call you, and a recruiter will basically speak in generic terms and say something along the lines of, hey, we saw your application for XYZ. We think you would be a good fit potentially in a different national security role. Would you be interested? And then they'll kind of outline that that national security role is managed through in-person interviews, and that they will fully fund and pay for your travel and relocation for an interview at this location. And then in that first interview, they go through a very generic, I mean, everybody's been through a job interview before. They
Yep.
go through a very generic interview that gets more and more intense as you show the right types of behavioral tells that you would be good at a clandestine role. And then by the end of that first interview, that's where they tell you, we would like to recommend you for a clandestine role with CIA, or thank you very much for your time. You'll hear from us a different day.
Yep.
Once they kind of disclose that they are recruiting for CIA, then they will tell you, if you plan to move forward with this role, we need you to effective immediately start telling people this different story, right? You came to Washington, D.C. because you're applying for various government jobs, or you're coming to McLean, Virginia, or you're coming to Nashville, Tennessee, or you're coming to Chicago, Illinois, in order to apply to, something else other than the National Clandestine Service.
Now, presumably, I've not been in this situation, but it seems to me that there would be some psychological weight to this ability or lack of ability to talk about what you do. I would guess as you get further into it, maybe you receive training or guidance about managing the psychological aspect of it. But I'm guessing that that first time you're told that these are the stakes, you don't necessarily have those skills. I mean, talk a little bit about the impact of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you find later in your career that you don't know when you're first being recruited
Right.
is that as you become a recruiter of future officers, that whole first interview is an assessment. That's all it is. It's a psychological assessment that is informal, executed by an experienced officer to determine whether or not the person who is a candidate is a suitable candidate.
Mm.
And then after that experienced officer's assessment, then when they introduce the idea of, hey, you are being invited to work for CIA, that's when the next interview is organized. And the next interview is the very clinical, very hard-hitting, multi-day psychological evaluation.
What are some of the maybe more either mundane or obscure things that you learn in training for the work that you did that could be surprising to some people, either because of the level of obscurity or just how mundane it might sound to the everyday person?
Yeah, one of the most interesting things, man, is how powerful questions are. And it's fascinating because we all talk about questions and we read about questions, and questions are something that you covered in exhaust, ad nauseum in college. But in everyday life, in the interactions between people, questions are a very powerful thing because they control the conversation. The person asking the questions controls the conversation.
Mm.
However, the person answering questions is the person who feels the most fulfilled by the conversation. So in essence, when you're asking somebody a question, you're making them feel good about themselves, especially if you're asking them questions where they know the answers. You see this all the time in your work, David, because you interview experts all the time about what they're good at. So they never have, they walk, for the most part, they walk away from a conversation with you feeling very good about themselves. That applies everywhere in the world, whether you're talking to your boss, whether you're talking to a car salesman, whether you're talking to your kid's teacher, whether you're talking to your kids themselves.
Mm.
When you ask questions that people can answer, they feel good about themselves. And by feeling good about themselves, they feel like they can trust you. And that gives you an incredible amount of control over where you take that relationship.
That's very interesting. And so this was relevant in your work insofar as you had to deal with all sorts of different people in all sorts of different situations, and understanding the way your questions to them would make them feel was relevant to your goals.
Right, because espionage is illegal. And this is something that people they don't understand. Espionage, which is the fancy word for spying, is illegal everywhere, including inside the United States. The only way that CIA can execute espionage is because there is a very specific carve-out in American law that says that a US citizen working at the direction of CIA is granted authorities by the president to break this law. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So when you're spying, when you're carrying out espionage, it's illegal everywhere. You never want to get caught. So everything you do is surreptitious. When you're collecting secrets from somebody, you can't just come out and say, what's the secret? What's the code to your nuclear missile program, Iranian general? What's the plan for Taiwan, Chinese military general? You can't ask those questions. You have to have some kind of conversation where you elicit those intelligence nuggets. And the only way you can have those conversations is by asking pointed, intentional, strategic questions that make people talk about things they shouldn't talk about.
When you think about the work that you did, what do you think would be most surprising to the average American about the substance of the sort of things that you were working on?
The most surprising thing that I think people don't understand is that secrets are very, very boring. Very, very boring. The kinds of stuff that is truly kept secret, it's not what kind of missile Russia has in its arsenal, right? Hypersonic missiles is not a secret. But what is a secret is the specific pressure that's maintained in the hypersonic missile's chamber for where it combusts the fuel source. That number is a secret, and a very, very well guarded secret that if the United States could get a hold of, we could essentially neutralize or sabotage the entire Russian hypersonic missile force,
Mm.
right? But nobody thinks, like, you can't make a James Bond movie about James Bond trying to find out the pressure ratio inside the combustion engine of a hypersonic missile. That's not a sexy idea.
Right.
So instead, we believe that secrets are sexy when really secrets are very, very boring.
All right. So this is really good context kind of for the sort of stuff that you worked on. So in the 5 years since we last spoke, and for disclosure to the audience, as far as I understand, you're more politically conservative than I am, and we'll see if I'm right about that, and we'll see if that kind of comes out in this conversation. Over the last 5 years, there has been a contingent of the American voting public, people who pay attention to what's going on, that has been increasingly hostile to American intelligence agencies, and this includes FBI prominently. It also applies to some degree to CIA, NSA, etc. Much of it was catalyzed by the investigation of Donald Trump by Robert Mueller and other events that are sort of we are publicly aware of. You, as someone who was inside this system for a while, has your opinion generically about American intelligence agencies in the context of the sort of news stories we've seen over the last 5 years, has your opinion changed about American intelligence agencies?
It's a twofold answer, right? I would say yes and no. So my opinion about the American intelligence services has always been that their job is to protect American interests, protect national security interests. But here's the kicker. National security interests are not the American people.
Mm.
And that's something that the American people misunderstand. FBI is not there to protect individuals. CIA is not there to protect individuals. It's there to protect the priorities that are set forth by Congress as national security priorities that protect the institution of the United States. So I very much believe that the CIA of today and the CIA of the 1970s and the CIA of the 2000s was always and remains very focused on that mission, protecting national security interests as set forth by the Congress, right? However, where I have seen my opinion change is in how they go about doing that. It used to be that the secret intelligence services, which are many, right? The intelligence community has 16 different secret intelligence services. The Army has their own service. The NSA is a service. The NGA is a service. The NRO is a service. The FBI is a service. They all have, there's multiple secret intelligence services inside the United States. What they used to do was serve in secret. Now they serve much more publicly. You have more and more leaks of people who anonymously give their opinions to various news sources. You have more and more people who are coming out and publicly leaving service and then publicly lambasting the administration that they served under. So you're seeing like a change, and it's very similar to the change that you see culturally across the United States, where people are becoming more politically verbal, more politically active on the far extremes, whereas the silent majority in the middle is being overlooked.
And in what way do you see this affect the individual at the expense, as you say, of this greater apparatus that the intelligence agencies defend?
Yeah, we need to understand that as individual American citizens, we have the freedom and the rights that are granted to us by our government to pursue our own happiness. But that doesn't mean that we can pursue our happiness at the cost of our neighbor's happiness. That's where the law comes into play, right? That's where our legalistic nature, our structure as a society is built upon. It's built upon my being happy does not cost David Pakman's being happy. We have to find a way to coexist and work together. The individual needs to understand that, because what happens at the national level is that when we start to go outside of the boundaries of the authorities or the mission set that we are given in order to share our opinion or irritate some existing challenge, like a political challenge. When you see CIA come out and comment on Donald Trump, that's not their role. That's FBI's role. FBI is supposed to investigate, right? You see the same thing when you see the constant back and forth threats of impeachment or the ousting of the House, the Speaker of the House, like attempted ousting of the Speaker of the House, like you're seeing here in Congress. Like, this is not your primary job. Your primary job is to keep the American people safe by protecting American national security interests and making sure our society as a whole gets stronger, not undermine the purpose and intent of your office that ultimately weakens our societal standing.
If you were to put a partisan filter over intelligence agencies generically, or if you want to just focus on CIA, we can. Do you believe that these agencies are more aligned with the priorities of either of the two major political parties right now, or that that would be the wrong sort of filter to apply?
The filter is always changing. You are 100% right by applying a filter, because you have to understand that the CIA and the FBI and the intelligence community serves at the behest of the executive branch.
Mm-hmm.
The executive branch is headed by the president. He is the chief, or she is the chief executive. So whenever the president changes, they change all of their leadership, which means the heads of each of these IC or intelligence community partners is always at risk of being replaced or changed. And then whoever is replaced is obviously one who is sympathetic towards the party of the ruling executive. So you see this constant rotation, then it filters down and down further and further. And if you consider presidents that run multiple terms, which is until recently, that was fairly common, you would have these 8-year stints where we'd have an 8-year conservative president, an 8-year progressive president. So over the course of those 8 years, multiple offices within the organizations, within the intelligence organizations, would then change to become sympathetic towards that ruling party.
There's a sense that within many of these agencies, and also non-intelligence agencies and large federal governments, there's a sense that many of the employees, while privately they may vote and they may have opinions, their jobs are primarily either bureaucratic in nature or related to intelligence gathering in a very narrow way that doesn't really allow for political bias in the sense that we might understand it. And there are some, really just some Republicans who have talked about replacing, even through something like Project 2025, traditionally bureaucratic or non-political federal government employees with political activist types. For example, it could be the Department of Education, could be bureaucrats at the IRS, could be intelligence agencies. By the standard you're talking about here, which is getting away from politics and getting towards national security, I would imagine you would be against such a change. Am I right in that assumption?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That would be a mistake. To politicize government service is to undermine the whole promise of government service, right? Government servants are supposed to serve the government, not a party. And the government is supposed to be something that is established by the voting rights of the people. So whether you like or disagree with whoever the people say should be in the administrative powerhouse, right? Whatever administration is set by the people, you and your job is to serve the government that was set by the people. So we've had a very functioning, effective, operational level of government for a long time. I mean, all across the IC. For anybody who lives in Washington, D.C., or anybody who's worked in government, you know that at the first 2 or 3 levels of your career, you are apolitical. Your job is to execute on policy, write and review changes to legislation, execute on basic operational needs that keep the government running. It's not until you've been in government for 10, 12, 15 years that you start rising up to middle management, which is a mandate of government service. You must either escalate or evacuate, really. As you start going up, that's when you start having to play this very political game where you have to understand the needs of your boss, whether they are politically leaning left or right, whether or not the policy is changing, and that's going to change the funding source, and that's going to change the prioritization. And then that just gets worse and worse the higher you get in a role.
I think there's a notion, which may not be true, that those who choose to get into law enforcement, intelligence, and military tend to be more politically conservative. To the extent that you had colleagues and coworkers the way many people do, and when you're working in a clandestine role, I don't know if you have that sort of relationship with colleagues and coworkers. Did you observe or even notice the political leanings of the people you worked with, or was it really kept out of the work that you did?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an example of just how secret these organizations are, right? In reality, David, the vast majority of people who go into intelligence work are liberal.
Is
They
that
are
right?
actually They are actually progressive,
Huh.
and they're hired between the age of 24 and 28. But what happens is as they gain years of experience dealing with the world outside of the United States, dealing with just the trash and the shit and the chaos and the corruption that exists everywhere else in the world, that also exists here, but by virtue of intensity, it's much less intense here. They start to see how important it is to maintain the United States as the world's global superpower. And then that progressive, as they become 30 and 35 and 40, and they become senior leaderships, they shift to a more center and even right position. But for the
Wow.
vast
That's
majority of
very
people
interesting.
for
Now,
the vast majority of people
obviously,
who come on, they're liberal.
I can't, this is Andrew's opinion. I have nothing with which to refute it because it's a claim about what's going on within these organizations. I don't know that that's true, but I understand that that's your opinion, which is the hiring is overwhelmingly younger, left-leaning folks who, through developing a cynicism almost through their work, become more centrist or conservative.
I wouldn't even call it cynicism, David. I would say that you got to keep in mind that the progressive and liberal ideals are based on ideology. They're based on a future idea of what things will hopefully look like or should look like, not based on a current acceptance of what the status is. That's why they're called progressive. They always want to progress beyond where we are trapped right now. That's exactly the kind of person that you want to recruit for a future-oriented organization that is trying to stay one step ahead of its enemy. If they were to recruit primarily from conservative-leaning audiences, you'd get a bunch of people who are focused on the present, who are focused on
Well,
all
or
the
even wanting to go
stereotypical
back to some
conservatism.
prior era to some degree.
Correct. Exactly right. People who are looking backwards, not people who are looking forwards. And I think what CIA has discovered and what NSA and what NRO and FBI has discovered is that when you can capitalize on talent that is progressive, liberal in terms of their ideology, they are highly educated, they are highly motivated, they are willing to do a job that's very challenging for a very low government pay in the hopes that they can make a difference in the future world. And then what happens is over the years, they develop a very clear, transparent set of understanding of what the world really does look like, how the world really does work, what it takes for America to protect American freedoms while also protecting against foreign threats. And through that transformation, those people that were more ideologically driven double down on their faith and belief in the American institution, but they change their politics.
And I'm guessing if they don't, they may end up failing out, right? I mean, there's like a sort of self-selection bias that's at play here as well.
Correct. And I wouldn't even call it failing out. I would call it, just like you said, self-selection. They
Interesting.
choose to pursue a different path, and they choose to leave to go into some other career path or some other, maybe government service or maybe political service or maybe, just standard commercial service.
You know, it's very interesting. I have friends within customs and border divisions, let's call it generically. There's a bunch of different departments. They report to me the exact opposite, which is that often they will see people join, sometimes themselves included, with a more reactionary basis about what one might be doing in terms of dealing with immigration. And seeing the reality of it, they see turns people, I don't know if you would call it through empathy or pragmatism or whatever, more towards the center or left from the right. And again, these are just people's opinions, but there could be different dynamics at play in different agencies, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely, because they're different mission sets, right?
Yeah.
So someone who's in Customs and Border Patrol is very focused on, just like you said, immigration issues versus national security issues, which is what your CIA or DOD would see, which is different from law enforcement issues, which is what
Right.
your FBI officers would see. Either way, I think it's what your question really hits on, David, is how valuable an empirical survey would actually be that gives some transparency.
Yeah.
We have an entire government office of this, right? We have the Government Accountability Office.
Right.
How incredible would it be for them to have an ongoing survey that essentially gives the American people a pulse of the political leanings of different organizations, right? Even if it was just a 5-question, very left, very right, somewhat left, somewhat right, totally neutral,
Yeah.
to give us a sense of who is it that really is representing us in terms of government offices?
I would be interested in that. All right. In the few minutes we have left, I want to talk a little bit about everyday espionage. So I'm curious what you think are the most useful skills from your career for the everyday person, speaking very honestly, because I've read a bunch of the different books where it's, I'm going to teach you lock picking and how to identify surveillance and run counter surveillance and how to booby trap your house, or things that are certainly interesting, but I am unclear how much they genuinely apply for the average person. So what are the things that really you think apply most for the average person from your skill set and training background?
You're totally right, David. You have to look past all of the alarmist, fear tactic marketing that goes into things like lock picking and booby trapping your
Yeah.
house and whatever else. And it sells, which is why it's so common. What I have found is the most useful set of skills are skills where you have a high probability likelihood that you have to use that skill.
Mm-hmm.
Picking a lock is a low probability skill, right? But being able to engage somebody in a social conversation, for example, being able to elicit information that is of interest to you without letting the other person know what you're eliciting. Elicitation is a super useful skill, very similar to what we were talking about earlier when we mentioned using questions and the art of questions.
Yeah.
Another fantastic skill is understanding how to use perspective to overcome perception. So if you think about it, we all view the world through our own point of view. That is our perception of the world around us. I think that is green. I think that is yellow. I think this tastes good. I think that tastes bad. Perspective means that you can step out of your point of view and step into a third point of view that watches what's happening in the overall environment. People who can gain perspective rather than be trapped by their own perception do better in negotiations, do better at making friends, do better in observing corporate exchanges, business exchanges, sales, account management, everything. You've also got skills like being able to master your memory, skills like being able to handle or reduce your anxiety or your response to fear, because oftentimes people are responding to something that causes them individual fear, again, talking about perception, rather than something that actually has a high probability of doing harm. So your classic example is a spider. People see a spider and they get scared. The chances of that spider being able to actually do you harm are very low. There are some spiders who can do it, but not many. So if you can understand how to respond to fear inputs by calming yourself down and refocusing your energy back into something productive, all of a sudden think about all the people who lose time and energy because they respond fearfully to an email. They respond fearfully to a Twitter update. They respond fearfully to a headline news scroll. If you can just learn how to manage that anxiety and manage that fear response, you can dedicate that energy into something more productive.
Are the techniques for fear and anxiety that come from your world at CIA similar to what, for example, the therapy world may offer, whether it's CBT or EMDR, whatever techniques they would be, or are they radically different?
They're not radically different. They're still based in clinical science, which is what the huge advantages that CIA officers have. We get training that's based in the grounded science of all the different disciplines that are out there. But then we add to that with a layer of operational utility. It's a term that we use, right? Operational utility. It means it's nice to reduce anxiety. Yes. It's even better to reduce anxiety and then redirect energy towards what your mission set is. So if you imagine the person who's having a meltdown at work, who then turns off their screen and takes 5 minutes of mindfulness, that's great. But then what do they do after that 5 minutes is over? They turn their screen back on and they get right back into the chaotic world that they're in. Whereas for us, it's more like, let's turn off our screen, enter into our 5 minutes of mindfulness, and then let's also talk about how do we leave this 5 minutes of mindfulness in the most productive way, which might mean going to the gym, or it might mean following up on a phone call for something that's personally relevant, not something that's professionally relevant. So you learn how to apply these clinical practices in a way that gives you operational benefit.
Very, very interesting. We've been speaking with Andrew Bustamante, former covert CIA officer and also founder of the Everyday Espionage training platform. Andrew, great to chat again. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure, David. I'll see you again, Ben.